Hi there, Connecting Point. We're going to be reading through 1 Samuel chapter 13, almost the whole thing. We're going to omit the last verse, but we're going to read through that this week. And I wanted to start you off with a table talk question this week. And that question is going to be, how important is popularity and personal charisma to leadership? Go ahead. So this week we pick up our story, Saul's story, with the story of the renewing of the conflict between the Philistines and the Israelites. And what we'll see is that there is a military disaster that is unfolding for the Israelites. And it sandwiches this story of Saul's efforts to keep a grasp on his power. So overall, chapters 13 through 15 are going to be used by the narrator to demonstrate Saul's unfitness to be the king of Israel. Now, as we read through the text, I'm going to be a little struck, and probably you will be a little struck too, by how quickly Samuel seems to be turning on Saul. And this kind of reinforces a feeling that we've kind of been hinting at, that Samuel's a little bit maybe responsible for setting Saul up to fail. But I want you to recall last week that we talked about Samuel's specific instructions to Israel, especially the idea around waiting for what God is up to. And that's going to foreshadow what we're going to see Saul fail to do in this text today. So our text follows this three-part structure. Verses 1 to 8 set up the stage of the Philistine threat. Verses 9 to 15 show Saul's failure. And in typical Hebrew fashion, the middle part is the main point of our text. And so it kind of has this, they call it the chiasm, right? Then verses 16 to 22 show Israel's new state of repression under the thumb of the Philistines. So let's begin this week by reading over the first of these three sections. So here we go, chapter 13, verses 1 through 8. And I'm reading from the NET translation. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign. He ruled over Israel for 40 years. Saul selected for himself 3,000 men from Israel. Of these, 2,000 were with Saul at Michmash and in the hill country of Bethel. The remaining 1,000 were with Jonathan at Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. He sent all the rest of the people back home. Jonathan attacked the Philistine outpost that was at Geba, and the Philistines heard about it. And then Saul alerted all the land, saying, "Let the Hebrews pay attention." All Israel heard this message. Saul has attacked the Philistine outpost, and now Israel is repulsive to the Philistines. And so the people were summoned to join Saul at Gilgal. Meanwhile, the Philistines gathered to battle with Israel, and then they went up against Israel with 3,000 chariots, 6,000 horsemen, and an army as numerous as the sand on the seashore. They went up and camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. The men of Israel realized they had a problem because their army was hard-pressed, so the army hid in caves, thickets, cliffs, strongholds, and cisterns. Some of the Hebrews crossed over the Jordan River to the land of Gad and Gilead, but Saul stayed at Gilgal. The entire army that was with him was terrified. He waited for 7 days, the time period indicated by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the army began to abandon Saul. So there's a few interesting things that have caused some translation questions in this first section of the text. And what we're really trying to do in this first section is set up the dire military position that the Israelites find themselves in. And we don't fully do that until we actually get to the end of the chapter. So one of the translation issues is those early numbers. I read them as 30 and 40 years. Saul was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he ruled over Israel for 40 years. It's really unclear what the manuscripts are saying in those things. They almost seem to be doing a summary work, and so maybe the idea is that Saul's about 30 years old when he begins his reign, and then he rules for about 40 years. It's really unclear exactly what's going on, but it's kind of trying to give this shape to the whole thing. What the author does do is compress time a whole bunch, because we have Saul as a young man when he's leading the Israelites out against the Ammonites, which we read about in chapter 11. And then Samuel's speech was last week. We talked about that in chapter 12. That seems to be right after that victory over the Ammonites. And then we get into this chapter, and Saul's heir apparent, his son Jonathan, is already a significant warrior and a battle chief for the people of Israel. So, but that kind of squeezing and compressing of time isn't really an uncommon thing in biblical narratives. It's just kind of one of those things that's like a yada 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 kind of a thing. Saul has been ruling for some length of time, and now he's got a son, Jonathan, who is also a significant warrior among the people. The size of the armies, you might suspect, is also a source of some controversy. Did the Philistines really have as many people as there are sand on the beach? No, but the different translations and manuscripts yield different numbers. Here's kind of a summary of what is trying to be said in this early section. Saul has now built a standing army. It's not a big one. It's only about 3,000 men. And he's split his troops so that he has the bulk of them, and Jonathan has the command of the rest of them. They're the two main captains. Jonathan attacks the Philistines. It's unclear again based on the manuscripts whether he's like taking out a minor official or if he actually is fighting an outpost. But either way, he wins this minor victory. And what it does is it kind of kicks the hornet's nest, and the Philistines are furious. So Saul summons the rest of the Israelites to actually come and like an ad hoc, like a levy kind of a thing, come join my war band here at Gilgal. And then Samuel sends along word that he's going to show up in a week's time to do sacrifices and bless the troops. And Saul is supposed to wait for Samuel to lead in the sacrifices before the troops head out. So it isn't clear just how big the forces that Saul and the Israelites are facing. But the significant issue is that the Philistines outnumber the Israelites, and they also bring to the battlefield chariots and cavalry. The Israelites are not employing either of these techniques and technologies right now, and this could definitely cause some problems. So the Israelites end up taking refuge. They have to flee from Michmash, and they end up taking refuge in a variety of stronger defensible positions, cisterns among them, and cliffs and strongholds and this kind of a thing. But because of the ill-looking odds, Saul's men are beginning to desert. And so Saul is facing this really nasty situation. His men are leaving and abandoning him, and he's facing down a superior military force. He's been installed to give confidence to the people, right? Give us a king so that we can be like the other people. We'll have a king to protect us from our enemies. But the measures that he's taken have obviously failed. And to compound the mess, Samuel says, yeah, I'll show up in a week. And then he doesn't show up. And so Saul's left with this horrible choice. What am I supposed to do? My men are leaving. I'm supposed to be waiting for the blessing of Yahweh before I go out to battle. And I can't hold all of these different stresses in balance here. So what am I going to do? Do I just sally forth with my troops and ignore the possibility of receiving the blessing of God? Do I just take the spiritual measures into my own hands and do the sacrifice rituals and just like forget Samuel, he's not here? Or do I just sit there and wait and possibly watch my troops continue to abandon me? So here's our next table talk. What would you have done in Saul's shoes? Okay, so let's pick up at verse 9. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings." Then he offered a burnt offering. Just when he'd finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel appeared on the scene. Saul went out to meet him and to greet him. But Samuel said, "What have you done?" And Saul replied, "When I saw that the army had started to abandon me, and that you didn't come at the appointed time, and that the Philistines had assembled at Michmash, I thought, now the Philistines will come down on me at Gilgal, and I have not sought the Lord's favor. So I felt obligated to offer the burnt offering." And then Samuel said to Saul, "You have made a foolish choice. You have not obeyed the commandment that the Lord your God gave you. Had you done that, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever, but now your kingdom will not continue. The Lord has sought out for himself a man who is loyal to him, and the Lord has appointed him to be leader over his people, for you have not obeyed what the Lord commanded you." And then Samuel set out and went up from Gilgal to Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin. Saul mustered the army that remained with him. There were about 600 men. Saul, his son Jonathan, and the army that remained with them stayed in Gibeah in the territory of Benjamin, while the Philistines camped in Michmash. Raiding bands went out from the camp of the Philistines in 3 groups. One band turned toward the road leading to Ophrah by the land of Shual. Another band turned towards the road leading to Beth Horon, and yet another band turned toward the road leading to the border that overlooks the valley of Zeboim in the direction of the desert. A blacksmith could not be found in all the land of Israel, for the Philistines had said, "This will prevent the Hebrews from making swords and spears." And so all Israel had to go down to the Philistines in order to get their plowshares, cutting instruments, axes, and sickles sharpened. They charged 2/3 of a shekel to sharpen plowshares and cutting instruments, and 1/3 of a shekel to sharpen picks and axes, and to set ox goads. And so on the day of the battle, no sword or spear was to be found in the hand of anyone in the army that was with Saul and Jonathan. No one but Saul and his son Jonathan had them. So Saul decides not to wait, and as he says, to seek the favor of the Lord on his own behalf. He performs the sacrifices himself. And as they're finishing it up, of course, then is when Samuel finally arrives. Now, Samuel is clearly extremely harsh in his assessment of what Saul has done, and the way that Saul shapes it and the way that Samuel responds, they seem a little out of whack. But the narrator has set it up to see that this is a failure on Saul's part with those instructions that Samuel had given to the people of Israel in chapter 12, verse 16. Recall from the message last week that Samuel had just recounted the history of Israel and of God's covenant faithfulness to them, and had showed the people how their request for a king was in violation of that covenant. And so he instructs them to take up positions and to wait and watch the Lord show up in power. And you'll recall that the Lord did show up in power, and he made it to thunder and rain, even though the weather shouldn't have been doing that at that time of year as the story was taking place. So we see an echo of this principle here. Saul, maybe somewhat justifiably, ends up just choosing to take the measures into his own hands. But throughout the Old Testament, what we see is that God doesn't need people to make themselves busy trying to do things for him. He shows up through the difficult circumstances. And you can think of many of your favorite stories through all of the sequences, beginning in Genesis, right? Abraham goes through a variety of trials, or Joseph, or you think of Joshua's military strategy at Jericho, which involved parading and having the trumpet section do a big soli, or of Gideon dismissing far more soldiers than was prudent to win his battle. Or even earlier in our story in 1 Samuel, where the Philistines are approaching to attack, and Samuel leads the nation not in a clever ambush, but rather in a prayer service and a time of sacrifice and repentance. And the text doesn't really give us any further clues as to Samuel's strong reaction beyond the strength of his rebuke. It all seems really harsh, and the commentators that I read emphasize the harshness of this all. Samuel mentions this kind of could-have-been scenario for Saul's kingdom, maybe becoming a forever dynasty kind of a thing, but that Saul, very shortly after his successes against the Ammonites, has already broken faith with Yahweh to a completely irredeemable degree in the eyes of Samuel. They're right, this is harsh. And it seems like a lot, but I'm thinking that what we are shown that we should be doing by the narrator is that we should give Samuel and the narrator the benefit of the doubt, as Samuel explains again the requirements of the king in verse 14. The king is supposed to be a man loyal to Yahweh first, not even to Israel first, certainly not to his own family's fortunes or his own popularity or prestige. Samuel had modeled this for the nation, and it was the issue that had ruled out his sons from taking over his ministry and his role. And now that's the exact issue where Saul has begun his fall. We'll come back to that question in a minute, but I want to kind of finish up the rest of the chapter, and then we'll return to this main point of our text today. As we move through the close of the story, we can look forward in our bigger story to chapters 16 and 17 to see that what we're trying to do here is set up this meteoric entry of David into the story. In chapter 16, he comes in privately and kind of more spiritually. And then in chapter 17, David flies into the scene very publicly and militarily. And so we need to see how high the stakes are for the nation of Israel, both in terms of the spiritual status of the monarchy, the kingship, and the military state of the nation. And we also have this beautiful story of David's friendship with Jonathan that is going to be weaving through the rest of our 1 Samuel narrative, and actually through the rest of David's story. And so we want to make sure that we're introducing Jonathan fully here too. And so the remainder of our story today reiterates this military conundrum that Israel faces. Samuel leaves Saul with a vastly reduced army. It's down from 3,000, and then whatever of the levy of Israel had come to meet up with that hardcore of the professionals. They're left with 600 men. And so Saul's only got this few hundred men, and they are unable to face down the threat of the angered Philistines, who the text says they go in these 3 different directions in their raid. And they're coming from the west, you'll recall, and so they're going to be going to the north, the east, and the south. Israel is on the ropes in every which direction they have. And to compound the problem, Israel seems to have had this odd relationship with the Philistines in the time leading up to this kind of crisis, where they had been trading with the Philistines and getting access to the Philistines' mastery of the technology of ironsmithing and sharpening. The Israelites don't seem to have their own smiths yet who can work iron, and the Philistines have this major technological advantage. So during these times of peace that they've been experiencing, it's fine because the Israelites just go to the Philistines and get edges put on their tools. But when war and conflict break out, it becomes this incredible problem as they can't even find swords to outfit their army with. And the narrator tells us that only Saul and Jonathan seem to have had edged weapons that were in any way comparable to those of the Philistines. We've become more acquainted with Saul's failings in leadership this week. He just didn't, whatever it was, he felt like he was losing his personal command of the troops. His personal charisma was on the decline, and so he tries to take authority in this other way by grabbing Samuel's authority, and Samuel rebukes him very viciously, and it just further compounds the problems. But we also see that Jonathan has maybe his own character flaws as a battle chief, right? He's maybe a good tactician and a fighter. He did win at the beginning of the chapter, and this is going to be undeniable once we see what he does in next week's story. But he's probably a little lacking in thinking about grand strategy, as he seems to think it's a good idea to take on a foe who has both superior numbers and superior weaponry in the Philistine army. But I want to return by coming back to that central question of our text today. What makes Saul a failure here? The harshness of Samuel's response to Saul's taking action has led the commentators to take a bit of a revisionist approach to this literature, where we're supposed to see Saul in their version as sympathetic and Samuel as unnecessarily harsh. After all, isn't the whole story of 1st and 2nd Samuel a book written to legitimize the rule of a man, David, who begins his career by essentially committing treason, right? And he steals the kingship from this family who was publicly anointed, right? From a merely human perspective, I think this might be a justifiable reading of this story. But of course, nothing that we look at in human history is merely human. God is the author of all of history, and so we need to see that there is another side to this whole affair that shows Saul's behavior as maybe more sinister than just innocently trying to do what he thinks needs to be done. I think what we see here in this story is that Saul is betraying either a lack of belief in Yahweh, he's treated the sacrifice as mere ceremony perhaps, or maybe it's a conviction that he can, in fact, act as the authority for himself. Recall back from chapter 4, the sin of the Israelites in taking the Ark of the Covenant out to the battlefield on their own authority, such that they sought to bring God into their problems to do their will rather than seeking first to do his will. Is Saul not doing morally kind of the same thing? I think that's where the author of this text is wanting us to land, and I think that's the justification for why Samuel comes in with the rhetorical guns ablazing towards Saul. Now, it's an interesting story, and we're going to see this contrast between Saul, who is insecure in his own character, and he's insecure in who he's supposed to be, contrasted with David more and more as the weeks progress and as we get introduced to David, and we see where the kingship is kind of supposed to be going. And Saul is not that place. Saul is not going to be living up to those standards, and this is kind of the first warning, or the first strike in the whole thing. Although Samuel seems to think he's already struck all the way out. But I want to put to you today that this very problem may be something that is hitting closer to home with churches today than is entirely comfortable. I think a lot of times we see leaders who push forward programs or theological positions that maybe seem like the right thing to be doing. But what these leaders is in fact trying to get God to work for them and for their own agenda, rather than remembering to make the main thing the main thing. We're supposed to be seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, not inflating our own kingdom or coming up with our own beliefs and ideas. We need to be faithful to what God has told us to do. And I wonder if more often than we'd like it to be, what this actually means that we should be doing in our churches is waiting and watching, rather than trying to accommodate to the whims of culture, be it through the flashy programs that we try to come up with, or through compromising on doctrines that might be unfashionable at the time. Maybe what we're being called to do sometimes is to take up a position in a way that will scare people away and cause desertions and cause abandonment of the church. I'm not sure. The church seems to have this responsibility, though, to be focused on making the main thing the main thing. Saul fails to do it in this story today, and it's a question that I think anyone who's involved in a church needs to be asking of their leadership. Are we making the main thing the main thing? But you know what? It isn't just a problem for the leadership in churches. I think this principle applies to the life of every believer. And so I'm going to give you a table talk to finish up today. Do you ever find yourself trying to do things for God, building his kingdom in your way, maybe rather than taking time to wait for him? And what sorts of things could you incorporate into your spiritual practice or discipline that might help you to defend against this overactivity, we'll call it? And take some time to pray one with another, and we'll see you all next week.